October 13th, 1998. The kind of crisp Kansas evening where the wheat fields seemed to stretch endlessly under a sky painted in amber and rust. Main Street in Wichita cut through the heart of a community where everyone knew everyone, where unlocked doors weren't carelessness but tradition, where the most serious crime in recent memory had been kids spray painting the water tower. That Tuesday night everything changed in the space between one heartbeat and the next, though nobody would realize it until morning. Sarah Hamilton's silver Honda Civic sat abandoned under the flickering streetlight outside Murphy's Five and Dime, keys glinting on the asphalt like fallen stars. The 19-year-old had finished her evening shift at Rosie's Diner just past 9 o'clock, same as she had every Tuesday for the past 8 months. Margie Walsh, the night cook, remembered Sarah hanging up her apron with that same quiet smile she always wore, mentioning something about stopping by the library before it closed. Normal, routine, the kind of detail that would later eat away at everyone who heard it, because normal was supposed to be safe. The car door hung open, interior light casting weak shadows across cracked vinyl seats. Sarah's purse remained on the passenger seat, $23 still tucked inside her wallet, alongside a photo of her younger brother Danny at his high school graduation. Her work shoes sat neatly side by side on the floor mat, replaced presumably by the white sneakers she'd been wearing when she left the diner. But the sneakers were gone, and so was Sarah, leaving behind only questions that multiplied like ripples in still water. The evening had been unremarkable until it wasn't. Tom Brennan, sweeping the sidewalk outside his hardware store around 9:15, remembered seeing Sarah's car parked normally. He'd noticed, because she usually drove straight home after work, her headlights cutting through the darkness as she headed toward the small apartment she shared with her mother on Maple Street. Margaret Foster, walking her arthritic collie around 10 o'clock, swore the car hadn't been there then. But Margaret's eyesight had been failing for years, and everyone knew it. The Hendricks teenager, sneaking back from a party around 11:30, claimed he'd seen someone near the car, but couldn't say if it was Sarah or someone else entirely. Sarah's shift at the diner had been typical. She'd served coffee to Harold Mitchell, who came in every Tuesday to escape his empty house and read yesterday's newspaper. She'd chatted with the Kowalski family about their youngest daughter's volleyball tournament, refilled coffee cups and cleaned tables with the methodical precision of someone who took pride in honest work. The regulars remembered her being cheerful, maybe a little tired, but nothing suggested the terror that would consume the next few hours. Her last customer had been Robert Wilson, though nobody would remember that detail for 25 years. He'd ordered coffee and apple pie around 8:30, sitting alone in the corner booth while grading papers from his guidance counselor position at the high school. Sarah had served him with her usual politeness, their interaction lasting no more than a few minutes. To everyone watching, it was just another routine exchange between a waitress and a customer, unremarkable in every way except for what it would later represent. The discovery came at dawn, when Linda Henderson realized her daughter hadn't come home. Sarah's bed remained untouched, her backpack still sitting by the front door where she'd left it before heading to work. Linda's initial calls to the diner and Sarah's few close friends yielded nothing but growing panic. By 6:17 that morning, Mrs. Chen from the flower shop had spotted the abandoned Honda and called 911, her voice shaking as she described the open car door and scattered keys that glittered in the morning sunlight like broken promises. The nightmare had officially begun, though its roots stretched back to a conversation in a diner booth that nobody had thought to remember. Sheriff Tom Anderson arrived at the scene with the measured calm of a man who had spent 23 years dealing with domestic disputes, drunk drivers, and the occasional cattle rustling case. His department consisted of himself, Deputy Janet Moore, and Deputy Rick Stevens, operating out of a converted storefront that still smelled faintly of the bakery it had once housed. Anderson's experience with missing persons extended to finding lost hunters and the occasional teenage runaway who usually turned up at a friend's house by midnight. But standing in that empty intersection at 7:30 that morning, staring at Sarah's abandoned car, while Linda Henderson's sobs echoed off the surrounding brick buildings, he understood with sickening clarity that this was different. Linda Henderson had positioned herself in a chair directly across from Anderson's desk before he'd even finished examining the crime scene, her red-rimmed eyes tracking his every movement with the desperate intensity of someone drowning. She clutched Sarah's high school yearbook photo like a talisman, the edges already worn smooth from her desperate grip. Her silence was more devastating than any scream, broken only by whispered details about Sarah's habits, her friends, her dreams of attending Kansas State University to study elementary education. Linda's composure cracked only when Anderson gently suggested that Sarah might have left voluntarily, her voice rising to a pitch that made the windows seem to vibrate as she insisted that her daughter would never disappear without explanation. The initial canvas revealed fragments that refused to form a complete picture. Anderson and his deputies knocked on every door within a 6-block radius, their notebooks filling with contradictory statements and half-remembered glimpses that seemed to shift with each telling. Mrs. Patterson remembered seeing a man walking near Sarah's car around 9:45, but couldn't describe him beyond tall and wearing dark clothing. The teenage clerk at the gas station insisted he'd seen Sarah's Honda driving past around 10:15, but admitted he couldn't be certain it was actually Sarah behind the wheel. By noon, volunteer search parties had organized themselves into methodical groups that fanned out across the surrounding farmland like desperate fingers reaching into the Kansas wilderness. The Kowalski family led teams through harvested cornfields, their voices calling Sarah's name until they went hoarse. Members of First Baptist Church checked abandoned grain silos and crumbling homesteads that dotted the landscape like forgotten monuments to harder times. The high school football team, classes cancelled for the day, trudged through drainage ditches and wooded areas along Miller's Creek, their cleats churning up mud and dead leaves as they searched for any sign of the girl who had served them coffee just hours before. Anderson coordinated the search from his cramped office, a wall map of Sedgwick County gradually filling with red pins marking areas that had been cleared and blue pins indicating locations that required follow-up investigation. The local radio station interrupted programming every hour with Sarah's description, the same details repeated like a prayer: 5'4", brown hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing jeans and a blue cardigan with mother-of-pearl buttons. Callers flooded the department's single phone line with tips that ranged from credible sightings to fever dreams, born of community hysteria. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation dispatched 2 agents by late afternoon, their arrival marking the transition from local emergency to potential homicide case. Agent Patricia Coleman, a 15-year veteran with experience in missing persons cases, interviewed Linda Henderson with clinical precision, while her partner, Agent Mark Sullivan, established a command center in the high school gymnasium. Coleman's questions probed areas that Anderson had avoided, asking about Sarah's romantic relationships, her financial situation, any recent changes in behavior that might suggest she had been planning to disappear. But every answer Linda provided reinforced the same conclusion. Sarah Hamilton was not a girl who ran away. She had been saving money for college, maintaining a B+ average while working part-time, helping her younger brother with homework every evening after dinner. Her last conversation with her mother had been about weekend plans to visit colleges in Topeka and Lawrence. These were not the actions of someone preparing to vanish, and as the sun set on October 14th without any trace of Sarah beyond her abandoned car, the word that nobody wanted to speak began settling over Wichita like a shroud. Abduction. The kind of crime that happened in cities, not in places where neighbors still borrowed cups of sugar and children rode bicycles without supervision until the streetlights came on. The first break seemed to come on day 4, when Miller's Creek yielded up a piece of blue fabric snagged on a rusted fence post about 3 miles southeast of town. The fabric matched Sarah's cardigan perfectly, down to the distinctive mother-of-pearl buttons that Linda Henderson had sewn on herself the previous Christmas. Deputy Moore found it during the methodical grid search, the torn material fluttering like a prayer flag in the October wind. For a moment, hope blazed through the search teams and volunteers who had been walking the same fields for days, their boots caked with mud and their faces etched with exhaustion. But hope, Anderson would later reflect, could be more cruel than despair. The fabric led nowhere. Bloodhounds brought in from Topeka lost the scent after 50 yards, confused by the creek water and the crisscrossing deer trails that carved through the surrounding woodland. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation sent 2 agents who photographed everything, bagged the evidence with clinical precision, and departed with promises to run tests that would take weeks to complete. Meanwhile, the search radius expanded to encompass nearly 40 square miles of farmland, abandoned homesteads and drainage ditches that had been carved into the prairie generations ago. Witnesses began contradicting themselves under the weight of repeated questioning. Tom Brennan, who had initially been certain about seeing Sarah's car at 9:15, now wavered between 9 and 9:30, his confidence eroding like topsoil in a Kansas windstorm. Margaret Foster insisted she'd seen a tall man near the car, then changed her story to a woman, then admitted she couldn't be sure she'd seen anyone at all. The Hendricks boy, pressed for details by increasingly frustrated investigators, offered descriptions that seemed to shift with each telling, until Anderson began to suspect the teenager was manufacturing memories to feel important. The community's initial unity began fracturing under the strain of unanswered questions. Rumors spread through coffee shops and church gatherings like viruses, each retelling adding new details that nobody could verify. Some whispered that Sarah had been involved with an older man. Others suggested she'd been running drugs for dealers from Wichita's East Side. These theories gained traction not because they were plausible, but because they offered explanations that felt less terrifying than random violence in a place where people still left their doors unlocked. The drifter they'd all hoped would provide answers turned out to be Earl Thompson, a 67-year-old veteran with severe arthritis who could barely walk the half-mile from the bus station to the shelter where he'd been staying. Thompson had indeed been near Main Street that evening, searching through garbage cans for returnable bottles, but the timeline investigators established through security camera footage from the bank placed him there nearly 2 hours before Sarah disappeared. His alibi was airtight, his confusion heartbreaking, and his release left the investigation with one less suspect and a growing sense that whoever had taken Sarah Hamilton had vanished as completely as she had. Agent Coleman's investigation into Sarah's personal life revealed a young woman whose biggest secret was her plan to surprise her mother with early college acceptance letters that she'd been hiding in her bedroom dresser. Sarah's diary, discovered beneath her mattress, contained the ordinary anxieties of a teenager worried about grades, college costs, and whether Jake Morrison from her chemistry class would ask her to homecoming. The entries from her final weeks showed no fear, no sense of being followed or threatened, no indication that she suspected the danger that was circling closer with each passing day. The forensic analysis of the torn fabric revealed Sarah's DNA and nothing else, no foreign fibers or biological material that might identify her attacker. The piece had been exposed to weather for days before its discovery, washing away potential evidence that might have led investigators to their suspect. The creek where it was found had been searched multiple times without yielding additional clues, leaving investigators with a single piece of cloth that confirmed Sarah had been in that location, but provided no insight into what had happened to her or where she might be now. By the end of October, the daily briefings had dwindled to weekly meetings, and the media attention that had initially focused national eyes on Wichita began shifting to other tragedies in other small towns. By Christmas of 1998, the case file had grown thick with dead-end reports and witness statements that led nowhere. Anderson found himself staring at the evidence board he'd constructed in the small conference room behind his office, red string connecting photographs and timeline markers in patterns that revealed nothing except his own desperation. Sarah's high school graduation photo smiled down at him from the center of it all, her eyes bright with the future someone had stolen from her. The initial media attention had faded as other stories claimed headlines, and the volunteer search teams had dwindled to a dedicated core of family friends and Linda Henderson herself, who continued walking the fields every weekend until the snow made it impossible. The year 2000 arrived with budget constraints and personnel changes that gradually pushed Sarah's case toward the back of filing cabinets. Deputy Stevens had left for a better-paying job with the state police, and his replacement, a young officer named Curtis Brooks, brought enthusiasm but no fresh insights to an investigation that had exhausted every conventional lead. Anderson, now dealing with a spike in methamphetamine-related crimes that demanded immediate attention, found himself apologizing to Linda Henderson during their increasingly brief monthly meetings. The case wasn't closed, he assured her, just dormant, waiting for new evidence or a witness to finally step forward. Linda had begun conducting her own investigation by then, driving the rural roads with Danny beside her, stopping at every farmhouse and trailer to show Sarah's photo to anyone who would look. Her car, an aging Ford Taurus that burned oil and rattled over cattle guards, became a familiar sight throughout the county. Some families welcomed her with coffee and genuine sympathy. Others, uncomfortable with the raw grief she carried like a physical weight, found excuses to end conversations quickly. But Linda persisted, accumulating theories and possibilities that she recorded in a composition notebook filled with her careful handwriting, building her own evidence board on the kitchen table where Sarah had once done homework and planned her future. The investigation had generated hundreds of tips, each one dutifully followed and documented, each one leading to another dead end. A trucker claimed to have seen Sarah hitchhiking near the interstate, but his description didn't match, and his timeline was impossible. A psychic from Kansas City insisted Sarah's body was buried near a red barn with a broken weather vane, leading to excavations at 7 different locations that yielded nothing but frustrated farmers and wasted resources. Anonymous callers reported suspicious vehicles, suspicious neighbors, suspicious behavior that invariably proved to be mundane when investigated. Anderson retired the evidence board in 2001, boxing up the photographs and reports in bankers' boxes that were stored in the basement of the municipal building alongside records of property disputes and traffic violations from decades past. The weekly meetings with Linda became monthly, then quarterly, then simply phone calls when she had new information to share or when anniversaries demanded acknowledgement. The case remained officially open, but practically speaking, it had joined the ranks of unsolved mysteries that haunted small-town law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. The passage of time brought new challenges that demanded attention. The methamphetamine epidemic that swept through rural Kansas in the early 2000s overwhelmed Anderson's small department with arrests, overdoses, and property crimes that required immediate response. Gang activity from Wichita began spilling into surrounding communities, bringing violence that made Sarah's disappearance seem like a relic from a more innocent time. New cases pushed old ones further into the shadows, and the young officers who joined the department knew Sarah Hamilton only as a name on a cold case file that nobody expected to solve. But Linda Henderson never stopped searching. She attended training seminars for families of missing persons, learning about new investigative techniques and advocacy strategies. She lobbied the state legislature for changes to missing person protocols, her testimony carrying the weight of lived experience that legislators couldn't ignore. She She maintained a website with Sarah's photo and case details, updating it religiously, even as web design trends changed and other families' tragedies claimed space on social media platforms that hadn't existed when Sarah disappeared. Through it all, she held on to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to her daughter, and that eventually the truth would surface like debris washing ashore after a storm. The years accumulated like dust on Sarah Hamilton's case file, each one settling deeper into the forgotten corners of Wichita's collective memory. Rosie's Diner changed hands in 2003, becoming Murphy's family restaurant under new management that painted over the faded yellow walls and replaced the cracked vinyl booths where Sarah had served coffee to the same customers for 8 months. The new owners, a young couple from Topeka, had never heard Sarah's story, and the locals who remembered rarely spoke of it anymore. Grief, like everything else in small Kansas towns, eventually got buried under the practical demands of daily survival. But Linda Henderson refused to let time erase her daughter. Every October 13th, she placed fresh flowers at the spot where Sarah's car had been found, a small memorial that the city council eventually formalized with a modest plaque reading, "In memory of Sarah Hamilton, 1979-1998. The question mark that should have followed that final date haunted Linda more than any period could have. She continued her weekly ritual of posting new flyers in shop windows and on community bulletin boards, even as the edges curled and the photocopied image of Sarah's face grew increasingly faded. The local teenagers who worked at the gas station and grocery store grew up thinking the grieving woman with the box of flyers was simply part of the town's landscape, like the grain elevator and the water tower. The high school guidance office, where Robert Wilson had once counseled students, underwent renovations in 2005. Fresh paint covering the walls where Sarah's college recommendation letters had once been discussed. Wilson himself had moved quietly through the years, his reputation as a dedicated educator growing with each graduating class. Parents trusted him with their children's futures. Teenagers confided their dreams and fears during private counseling sessions, and church members respected his steady presence in the front pew every Sunday. His involvement in youth activities expanded as he aged, coaching little league teams and organizing church camps where he was beloved by children who saw him as a grandfather figure. Detective Maria Santos arrived in Wichita in 2015 with a degree in criminal justice and experience working cold cases in Kansas City. Her assignment to review the department's unsolved files was meant to be routine administrative work, updating digital records and ensuring proper evidence storage protocols. But Santos found herself drawn to Sarah's case with an intensity that surprised her supervisors and concerned her family. Perhaps it was the meticulous documentation that Anderson had maintained, or the monthly visits from Linda Henderson, who still came to the station with new theories and fresh determination. Santos began making her own monthly pilgrimages to Linda's modest house on Maple Street, listening to stories about Sarah's childhood, her dreams, her relationship with her younger brother Danny, who had grown up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance. The evidence boxes told their own story of institutional memory loss. Anderson's careful handwritten reports had been scanned into digital formats that stripped away the emotional weight of his words. Crime scene photographs that had once covered evidence boards now existed as computer files, among thousands of others. The physical evidence itself remained properly stored, but the human connections that had once driven the investigation had been severed by retirements, departments transfers, and the simple passage of time. Santos found herself becoming the bridge between Sarah's story and a new generation of investigators who knew her only as case number 1998-0847. The department had modernized significantly since Sarah's disappearance, with computer databases replacing handwritten logs and digital cameras supplanting Polaroid snapshots. But these technological advances highlighted how primitive the original investigation had been by contemporary standards. DNA testing in 1998 had been expensive and time-consuming, reserved for the most serious cases with sufficient biological evidence. The single hair found on Sarah's torn cardigan had been preserved but never processed, waiting in an evidence locker for technology and budgets to catch up with investigative needs. Santos convinced her supervisor to authorize DNA testing of the preserved evidence in 2017, nearly 20 years after Sarah's disappearance. The hair sample was so degraded that initial attempts failed to extract a usable genetic profile. But forensic science had continued advancing, and techniques that seemed impossible in 1998 had become routine by 2020. Santos submitted the evidence for advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis, a process that could potentially identify genetic markers from even severely compromised samples. The wait for results stretched into months, then years, as the state crime lab worked through a backlog of cases that had accumulated during decades of underfunding and understaffing. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2023, when Detective Santos was reviewing witness statements from a domestic violence case that had kept her awake most of the previous night. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Jennifer Mitchell from the State Crime Lab, her tone carrying the careful neutrality that forensic scientists maintained when delivering results that could change lives. The DNA sample from Sarah Hamilton's case had finally yielded a profile, she explained, and the genetic markers had been run through the combined DNA index system with results that Santos needed to hear in person rather than over an open phone line. Santos made the 2-hour drive to the lab in Topeka through farmland that was just beginning to show the first green hints of spring, her mind racing through possibilities that ranged from closure to heartbreak. The lab occupied a modern building that seemed incongruous among the government offices that surrounded it, all glass and steel efficiency designed to process the biological remnants of human tragedy. Dr. Mitchell met her in a conference room lined with certificates and awards that testified to the laboratory's reputation for precision and reliability. But her expression carried weight that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. The DNA profile extracted from the single hair belonged to a male subject whose genetic markers had been entered into the national database during a routine background check in 2019. Santos stared at the name on the computer screen, feeling the familiar sensation of a case shifting beneath her feet like unstable ground. Robert Wilson. The name meant nothing to her initially, just another entry in a database that contained millions of profiles from convicted felons, military personnel, and civilians who had submitted samples for various administrative purposes. But as Dr. Mitchell pulled up Wilson's background information, Santos began to understand why her hands were trembling. Wilson's profile indicated he'd been a high school guidance counselor in Wichita from 1995 to 2018, exactly the period when Sarah Hamilton had been a student and then a victim. His DNA had been collected during the background check required for his volunteer position with a youth mentorship program, a routine procedure that had been instituted after a series of scandals involving adults in positions of trust. The match was unequivocal, the statistical probability of error so remote that it existed only in theoretical mathematics. After 25 years of questions, science had provided an answer that nobody had expected. Santos drove back to Wichita in a state of controlled shock, her mind attempting to reconcile the beloved community figure she had researched with the biological evidence that connected him to Sarah's disappearance. Wilson's reputation was spotless, his service record exemplary, his standing in the community unassailable. Parents had trusted him with their children's futures for decades. Teenagers had confided their deepest fears and aspirations during private counseling sessions, and church members regarded him as a pillar of moral authority. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that Santos found herself questioning the test results despite knowing they had been verified multiple times. The investigation that followed the DNA match required delicate coordination with multiple agencies and careful attention to preserving evidence that might have been contaminated by decades of handling. Santos worked with federal agents to obtain Wilson's employment records, financial information, and personal history without alerting him to the investigation. What they discovered painted a picture of a man who had lived an unremarkable life in plain sight, his only notable characteristic being the consistent praise he received from students, parents, and colleagues throughout his career. Wilson's personnel files revealed that he had been Sarah Hamilton's guidance counselor during her senior year, responsible for helping her navigate college applications and career planning. Their documented interactions had been routine and professional, consisting of scheduled appointments and brief encounters in hallways and cafeterias. But the DNA evidence suggested a connection that went far beyond administrative paperwork, a relationship that had ended in violence on the October night 25 years ago. Santos found herself studying Wilson's photograph from the high school yearbook, searching for signs of the predator that genetic science insisted he must be, but finding only the smiling face of a man who had spent decades earning the trust and respect of an entire community. The arrest warrant was prepared with meticulous attention to detail, every procedure reviewed and confirmed to ensure that 25 years of waiting wouldn't be undermined by technical errors. Santos called Linda Henderson the night before the arrest, her voice steady despite the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. After a quarter-century of questions, she told Sarah's mother they finally had answers. Whether those answers would bring closure or create new agonies remained to be seen, but the silence that had surrounded Sarah's disappearance was about to be broken by the sound of handcuffs and Miranda rights being read to a man who had hidden his secrets behind a facade of respectability for longer than most people could imagine. The arrest warrant was executed at 6:15 on a Thursday morning, when Robert Wilson was stepping out of his modest ranch house on Elm Street to retrieve the newspaper from his driveway. Detective Santos had coordinated with state agents to ensure overwhelming force, not because Wilson was expected to resist, but because 25 years of freedom had given him time to prepare for this moment in ways that kept her awake at night. The 58-year-old man who answered his door in a bathrobe and slippers bore little resemblance to the younger guidance counselor who had smiled from staff photos in Sarah Hamilton's high school yearbook. But his eyes held the same calculating intelligence that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for a quarter-century. Wilson's neighbors gathered on their porches and lawns as he was led away in handcuffs, their faces reflecting the particular horror of discovering that evil had been living next door, coaching their children, shaking their hands at church every Sunday. Mrs. Patterson, whose grandson had played third base on Wilson's Little League team for 3 seasons, would later tell reporters that she felt physically sick watching the arrest, remembering how Wilson had always volunteered to drive kids home after practice when their parents were running late. The man they thought they knew had been a phantom, a carefully constructed persona that concealed something monstrous underneath. The charges read like a legal document, but the human impact was immediate and devastating. Parents who had trusted Wilson with their teenagers during guidance counseling sessions began questioning every interaction, every recommendation, every moment their children had spent alone with him. Pastor Michaels from First Baptist, where Wilson had served as a deacon for 15 years, found himself fielding anguished calls from congregation members who couldn't reconcile the gentleman who had helped organize youth retreats with someone capable of murder. The cognitive dissonance was so profound that many initially refused to believe the charges, insisting there had been some terrible mistake. The revelation sent shockwaves through institutions that had employed Wilson for decades. Wichita High School immediately placed the guidance department under review. examining every case file and student interaction from Wilson's 23-year tenure. The Little League organization suspended all activities pending a comprehensive investigation into Wilson's coaching history, while parents demanded answers about background check procedures that had failed to detect a predator in their midst. The church council called emergency meetings to address questions about Wilson's access to youth programs and overnight retreats where he had supervised children without adequate oversight. Linda Henderson received the call from Detective Santos at 7:30 that morning, 25 years and 5 months after her daughter had vanished. The words seemed to echo in her kitchen, as if spoken from the bottom of a well, each syllable carrying the weight of decades spent wondering. An arrest had been made. DNA evidence. A confession was anticipated. Linda found herself unable to respond, the phone trembling in her hand as 25 years of questions suddenly crystallized into the promise of answers she wasn't sure she was strong enough to hear. The media attention that followed Wilson's arrest was unlike anything Wichita had experienced since Sarah's disappearance. News vans lined Elm Street. Reporters thrust microphones at anyone willing to speak about the man who had counseled their children and coached their Little League teams. Former students struggled to reconcile their memories of Mr. Wilson's encouraging words during college planning sessions with the reality of his alleged crimes. Parents who had praised his dedication now found themselves wondering what signs they had missed, what red flags they had dismissed as eccentricity or professional commitment. Wilson's arrest photograph showed a man who appeared smaller and older than his reputation suggested, his carefully combed hair unable to hide the age spots that covered his scalp. But his expression remained composed, almost serene, as if the 25 years of deception had finally lifted a burden he had carried since that October night in 1998. The booking process revealed no tattoos, no scars, no physical evidence of the violence he was accused of committing. He was fingerprinted and photographed with the same clinical efficiency applied to drug dealers and domestic abusers. His transformation from respected community member to accused killer complete. In the space between the closing of handcuffs and the slamming of a cell door, Wilson's confession came during the 3rd day of interrogation, delivered in the same measured tone he had once used to discuss college applications and career paths with anxious teenagers. He spoke of Sarah Hamilton as if she were a case study rather than a human being whose life he had ended, describing how he had approached her that October evening under the pretense of offering college recommendation letters he claimed to have forgotten to give her. Sarah, trusting her former counselor implicitly, had agreed to accompany him to the high school to retrieve the documents from his office. Her faith in adult authority proving to be the vulnerability he had been waiting to exploit. But they never made it to the school. Wilson had instead driven to the abandoned grain elevator on the outskirts of town, a towering concrete monument to agricultural prosperity that had been empty for over a decade. Detective Santos listened to the recording of his confession with growing revulsion, his clinical descriptions of premeditation and opportunity revealing a mind that had been planning this crime for months before executing it with calculated precision. He had chosen the location carefully, scouting it during weekend drives that he had disguised as casual explorations of the countryside surrounding Wichita. The grain elevator had provided everything Wilson needed: complete isolation, multiple levels that could muffle sound, and a complex internal structure that would have made escape impossible for his victim. He described leading Sarah inside under the continued pretense of needing privacy to discuss her college prospects, his voice remaining steady as he recounted her growing confusion and then terror as she began to understand that something was terribly wrong. The moment of recognition in her eyes, he told investigators, was when she had finally grasped that the trusted adult she had followed into darkness intended to harm her. Wilson's confession revealed the methodical nature of his crime. planned not in a moment of passion, but cultivated over months of interaction during Sarah's senior year. He had used his position as guidance counselor to study her schedule, her habits, her trusting nature that made her an ideal victim for someone who understood how to manipulate teenage psychology. The recommendation letters he had promised were fabrications, props in a performance designed to isolate Sarah from safety and witnesses. His knowledge of her college plans, her work schedule at the diner, her relationship with her mother, had all been gathered during legitimate counseling sessions that he had corrupted into reconnaissance missions. The violence that had followed Sarah's rejection of his advances was described by Wilson with the same dispassionate tone he might have used to discuss a student's poor grades. When she had threatened to scream and tried to run toward the elevator's exit, he had struck her with a piece of concrete debris that lay scattered throughout the abandoned structure. The blow had been fatal, he admitted, though he had spent several minutes ensuring that she was dead before beginning the process of concealing his crime. The clinical precision of his confession suggested someone who had rehearsed this moment for years, preparing for the day when scientific advancement might connect him to his victim. The disposal of Sarah's body had been accomplished with the same methodical planning that had characterized the entire crime. Wilson described using construction materials that had been left behind during the elevator's decommissioning to create a makeshift grave within the structure's foundation, burying Sarah beneath concrete and steel that would have made discovery nearly impossible, even if investigators had thought to search the location. The torn piece of her cardigan found at Miller's Creek had been placed there deliberately, he confessed, designed to misdirect the investigation away from the actual crime scene and toward the rural areas where search teams had spent weeks looking for clues that didn't exist. Santos found herself struggling to maintain professional composure as Wilson's confession continued, his matter-of-fact descriptions of violence and deception revealing a predator who had spent decades perfecting his public persona while concealing the calculated cruelty beneath. The recommendation letters, the guidance counseling, the coaching and church activities had all been part of an elaborate camouflage designed to provide access to potential victims while establishing a reputation that would shield him from suspicion. Sarah Hamilton had been neither his first target nor his last choice, but simply the victim whose trust he had been able to exploit most effectively when his need for violence finally overcame his self-control. The courtroom in Sedgwick County had never hosted a trial that drew such intense scrutiny from both local residents and national media outlets. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by the time proceedings began on a grey Monday morning in October 2023, exactly 25 years after Sarah Hamilton had disappeared. Linda Henderson sat in the front row directly behind the prosecutor's table, her hands folded in her lap with the same rigid composure she had maintained during those first desperate days of searching. She had dressed carefully for this moment, wearing the blue cardigan that matched the one Sarah had been wearing that final night, a detail that wasn't lost on the reporters who filled the back rows with their notebooks and cameras. Robert Wilson entered the courtroom in shackles and an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish him physically, though his eyes remained alert and calculating. The man who had once commanded respect as a guidance counselor and church deacon now appeared frail and elderly, his thinning hair combed carefully over a spotted scalp. But when he glanced toward Linda Henderson, the brief connection between killer and victim's mother carried an electric tension that made several spectators shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was the first time they had been in the same room since Sarah's disappearance, though Wilson had attended her memorial service in 1999, sitting quietly in the back pew, while Linda had delivered a tearful eulogy. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 6 days, each piece of evidence adding weight to a story that had remained hidden for a quarter century. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez presented the DNA match with clinical precision, calling Dr. Mitchell to explain the scientific process that had finally connected Wilson to Sarah's torn cardigan after 25 years of technological advancement. The confession recordings filled the courtroom with Wilson's own voice, describing the premeditation and violence he had inflicted, his words echoing off the wood-paneled walls like accusations that could no longer be denied or explained away. But it was the testimony of Wilson's former students that provided the most chilling insight into his methods. 3 women, now in their 40s with children of their own, described how Wilson had gradually tested boundaries during their senior year counseling sessions, asking inappropriate questions about their dating lives and making comments about their appearance that had left them uncomfortable but uncertain whether they should report him. Jennifer Morrison, who had graduated 2 years before Sarah, testified through tears about how Wilson had offered to help her with college applications, then insisted they meet after school hours when the building was largely empty. His behavior had been subtle enough that she had convinced herself she was imagining things, but looking back through the lens of Sarah's murder, every interaction took on a sinister significance. The defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named David Cruz, who had drawn the impossible task of representing Wilson, focused on his client's age and previously clean record, arguing that the confession had been coerced and that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated during the decades it spent in storage. But Cruz's arguments felt hollow against the weight of testimony from Wilson's own mouth, recorded confessions that had been played for the jury in Wilson's flat, emotionless voice, as he described leading Sarah to her death with the calculated precision of someone who had planned every detail in advance. Linda Henderson took the witness stand on the 4th day, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the daughter Wilson had stolen from her. She spoke of Sarah's dreams of becoming an elementary school teacher, her plans to attend Kansas State University, her excitement about the future that stretched ahead of her like an endless highway. The courtroom fell silent as Linda described the 25 years of anniversaries and birthdays celebrated alone, the graduations and weddings Sarah would never attend, the grandchildren she would never hold. When Martinez asked her to identify the man who had murdered her daughter, Linda's gaze found Wilson across the courtroom, her eyes holding his for a long moment before she whispered his name with the weight of a quarter-century's worth of unanswered questions finally given voice. When the jury returned after less than 4 hours of deliberation, their unanimous guilty verdict on charges of first-degree murder seemed anticlimactic after 25 years of questions. The judge's sentence of life in prison, without possibility of parole, was delivered to a courtroom so silent that the ventilation system sounded like thunder. Wilson showed no emotion as he was led away, but Linda Henderson collapsed into sobs that seemed to release decades of suppressed grief, her body shaking as relatives and friends surrounded her with embraces that couldn't fill the void Sarah's absence had carved in their lives. The closure they had all imagined would accompany Wilson's conviction felt different than anyone had expected, complicated by the realization that justice delayed was a poor substitute for justice served when it might have prevented other crimes. The community's reckoning with Wilson's betrayal extended far beyond the courthouse steps. Parents who had trusted him with their teenagers began questioning every interaction, every private conference, every moment their children had spent alone with the man they now knew had been a predator, hiding behind a facade of professional respectability. The Little League organization disbanded Wilson's former team, retiring his jersey number and removing his photograph from the trophy case that had once celebrated his coaching achievements. First Baptist Church held special counseling sessions for congregation members struggling to reconcile their memories of Deacon Wilson with the reality of his crimes, though many families quietly transferred their membership to other congregations rather than face the daily reminder of their misplaced trust. The revelation that Sarah's remains lay beneath the municipal park where children had played for years created a new horror that the community struggled to process. The playground equipment was removed overnight, yellow police tape cordoning off an area where swings and slides had occupied space above what was essentially a grave. Parents who had pushed their children on those swings, who had celebrated birthday parties on grass that covered Sarah's final resting place, found themselves haunted by the grotesque irony of joy existing above such profound tragedy. The excavation that followed Wilson's confession would take weeks, complicated by the concrete and steel he had used to ensure Sarah's body would never be found by conventional searches. Detective Santos found herself fielding calls from law enforcement agencies across Kansas and neighboring states, investigators wondering if Wilson's crimes extended beyond Sarah Hamilton. His employment history revealed positions at 3 different schools over his career, each transition explained by promotions or better opportunities that now seemed potentially sinister. The background checks that had failed to detect his predatory nature highlighted systemic failures in how institutions protected vulnerable populations from those who sought positions of trust specifically to exploit them. Santos began building cases around suspicious patterns in Wilson's career, unsolved disappearances that had occurred in communities where he had worked, though proving connections across decades would require the same technological advances that had finally brought him to justice in Sarah's case. The psychological impact on Wichita extended beyond those who had known Wilson personally. The revelation that evil could hide behind such a convincing mask of respectability forced residents to question their fundamental assumptions about safety and trust in small communities where everyone was supposed to know everyone. The guidance counselors, coaches, and church leaders who had once been trusted without question now faced scrutiny that felt both necessary and tragic. Their genuine dedication to helping young people overshadowed by the knowledge that monsters could wear the same uniforms and carry the same credentials as saints. Linda Henderson visited the excavation site daily during the weeks it took to recover Sarah's remains, standing behind police barriers while forensic anthropologists worked with brushes and screens to separate her daughter's bones from the concrete that had hidden them for 25 years. The DNA confirmation that these were indeed Sarah's remains brought a closure that felt simultaneously complete and inadequate, the physical proof of her death providing answers while raising new questions about the life she might have lived. As the investigation into Wilson's background continued, Linda found herself wondering how many other families were still searching for children whose disappearances might finally be explained by the confession of a man who had spent decades hiding his crimes behind a smile and a helping hand. If this case has captured your attention, and you're interested in supporting investigative journalism that brings closure to families like Linda's, please consider subscribing to our channel, where we continue to explore cold cases that demand our collective attention and determination to seek justice, no matter how many years have passed.